When we talk about survival horror games, there's usually only a couple of paths that people take. They might start with the classic Lovecraftian horror game Alone in the Dark, or Sweet Home, the well-known predecessor to Resident Evil, or text adventure games like The Lurking Horror. They might even talk about predecessors like Haunted House, or dungeon exploring games on mainframes. The truth is, though, the road of ideas and development that led to survival horror is much more unusual, bumpy, and tied to other games and genres than a simple progression of only a couple of titles. And from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, a mostly forgotten series existed that stands as a highly interesting and formative example of this. It combined dungeon crawling with horror elements, and acted as a bridge for many worlds influencing early gaming. The works of H.P. Lovecraft, a burgeoning world of tabletop gaming, and the beginnings of a plethora of RPGs that would create variations on the design mentality of a wizardry game. These unusual titles would start with a game that began to form a lot of the building blocks of the horror genre, using high difficulty to play off of tension and fear while bringing in greater story elements than simple shock. Strongly influential, this title and its successors began to carve out ideas and concepts that horror games would adopt in decades to come. But unusual business decisions, a misguided attempt at a mixed media blitz, and some poor choices in timing involving the releases of later games in the series caused them to fade into obscurity. Even if their owners still persisted to find ways to keep telling tales of this universe and its characters, and the world they created found much greater success in other formats. This is the story of the Ghost Hunter series, not just Laplace No Ma and its many ports, its sequels Paracelsus No Maken and Kurokishi no Kamen, but also the tabletop games derived from the series, as well as the people and companies that made them, and helped branch out computer and tabletop RPGs into genres that stretched out beyond more than just science fiction and fantasy. To understand the road to Laplace No Ma, we have to talk about how tabletop role-playing came to Japan. It starts, as many things do, with Dungeons & Dragons, and a Japanese science fiction critic and professional translator named Hitoshi Yasuda. According to a translation of many of Yasuda's remarks posted on EN World in 2023, verified with translations of his own memoirs, Yasuda became exposed to Dungeons & Dragons and computer game RPGs almost simultaneously in the very early 80s. At around the same time, he would also be hired by Koichi Sato, head of the magazine Hobby Japan, to translate one of the first tabletop RPG games intended for import, Game Design Workshop's complex science fiction toolbox, Traveler. He says about the call, "Although I had wanted to do it, since it was unexpected and from someone I hadn't anticipated, I answered the phone nervously. But when I heard the request, I was over the moon. Finally, my wish is coming true, I thought. Of course, I put my heart into the translation, but from that point on, requests started coming in one after another." While Yasuda was working on this daunting new influx of work, he also continued publishing articles as a freelance writer, with some of them making it into Adventure SF magazine. Unfortunately, however, Hobby Japan and Yasuda were not able to get Traveler out as quickly as intended, and were beaten out by competitors, being outpaced by Yutaka Tama's Enterprise, a tabletop RPG based on Star Trek with systems similar to RuneQuest, and arguably one of Japan's first domestically developed tabletop RPG games. Others would soon follow at a rapid rate, and the burgeoning tabletop RPG scene would eventually cause a group of students to ask Yasuda to become an advisor as the hobby grew and grew. This large group would eventually coin itself with the name Group SNE, named after the syntax error output given in BASIC. While being involved with the group, as syntax error began to record playthroughs of their games, Yasuda would continue working as a writer, becoming involved with lots of other gamebook translation work among his own articles and stories. This would lead to him eventually becoming involved with publisher KADOKAWA Shoten. While he initially thought he would be hired to translate a Japanese version of the Dungeons & Dragons module Dragonlance, the company had in mind something a little different. Published playthroughs of tabletop games to compete with and differentiate from magazines by competitors, such as ASCII's Login. For KADOKAWA Shoten, Yasuda created a playthrough series for the magazine COMPTIQ along with other members of SNE. This playthrough would become the basis for the Lodos franchise, but it would also have the side effect of putting Yasuda in touch with more members of the gaming industry, which would lead to a strong relationship with one company in particular that had a very interesting story that had developed over the last couple of years. In 1982, Mamoru Imanishi, founder of a new company, Hummingbird Soft, had an idea. The son of a real estate magnate in the Kyoto company MAC, he had managed to get a branch of his father's business and turn it into a software house. Looking to differentiate from other companies, he would determine that Hummingbird Soft would sell their adventure games on disc only, at least initially. This was done to give their games a unique air, and it worked, gaining contemporary coverage of its titles just on that fact alone. And for the next couple of years, Hummingbird Soft would release some of the earliest adventure titles for the FM7, FM8, PC-88, and other machines. Games such as The Palms, and science fiction war stories Abyss 1 and 2. But it was the brother of the founder, Hiroshi Imanishi, not the Nintendo director, a different individual, who would be critical in getting Group SNE on board with the company, as he knew Yasuda personally. And while there would eventually be a long and fruitful partnership between SNE and Hummingbird Soft, making games based on record of Lodos War media, there was something else that the Imanishi brothers wanted to try first, based on a rather popular RPG that had been imported in due to special interest in Japan. Originally an aborted attempt to create a horror RPG in the vein of Lovecraft, reportedly called either Dark Shadows or Dark World, sources conflict, and designed by Kurt Lortz, brother of Steve Lortz, one of the original players of Blackmoor, the war game that would evolve into Dungeons & Dragons. Call of Cthulhu would be extensively retooled by game designers Sandy Peterson and Lynn Willis, adding things like sanity meters to try to create a scarier and more focused experience than the typical RuneQuest or D&D game. Chaosium, the publishers of Call of Cthulhu, would export this game through Hobby Japan, and Hobby Japan would publish elements of it such as playthroughs, scenarios, and rule sets in their magazines. This influence would spread, as it tied to a Japanese interest in Lovecraft that had existed for decades, such as when Gegege no Kitaro author Shigeru Miyazuki adapted the Dunwich Horror into a manga in 1963. While not as popular as Lodos would become, a cult following around this sort of horror was beginning to gather steam, and it was in this environment that Yasuda would come up with a game idea similar to a Call of Cthulhu session, and, knowing Imanishi, asked Hummingbird Soft to bring it forward. So in late 1986, work would begin on Laplace No Ma, also known as the Demon of Laplace, taking its name from the theoretical mathematical concept that knowing every value of every particle in the universe would lead to knowing everything's past and future paths. From an article in January 1987 in COMPTIQ, we know that the sanity meters, here repurposed as a kind of magic points bar with the same insanity penalty as the Chaosium game, were one of the earliest systems designed, but the general concept for development was very clear. Make a wizardry clone, but make it horror, and make it as close to the experience of Call of Cthulhu as possible, even if it wasn't necessarily adapting that system. And while Yasuda wasn't directly involved with the coding, he did supervise the designs of the environment, crafting a haunted mansion filled with ghosts, bats, and traditional horror monsters. The access given by the developers to COMPTIQ magazine allowed them to do something extraordinary as well. 2 months after the visit, they began to write a comprehensive strategy guide in monthly installments before the game was even released on store shelves, with the intention of finishing up day and date with when the game was available to buy. This didn't go as well as expected, but not for the reason you might think. Delays will come later. One of the most prominent features of early dungeon crawler games like Wizardry was their difficulty, where total party kills, obtuse puzzles, and tough combat was the norm. To Yasuda and Hummingbird Soft, though, this was a much too easy and simplistic baseline, and they assumed that players who were fans of these games might need to be challenged by a tougher experience. And, to put it simply, due to that thought process, Laplace No Ma is difficult, enough so that it makes most dungeon crawlers look quite easy by comparison. Due to this, the guide, which was only supposed to take a couple of months, took almost an entire year to be finished. But it's from this guide, meant to be utilized for the PC-88 version, that we can learn more about the game's unusual systems and quirks. A class-based dungeon crawler, you could create your character based on a couple of different archetypes. The strong and intuitive but not magically inclined detective. The supernaturally gifted but weak psyker. The intelligent and perceptive but only moderately strong scientist. The almost useless in combat journalist whose ability to take photographs creates one of the only ways of making money in the game. And the all-around dilettante, a kind of Van Helsing spiritual academic that can understand puzzles and lore better than any other class. You can even train your character, gaining more initial money, and the opportunity of changing careers at the risk of advancing the future party members' ages. But this runs the risk of death each time you train. In a pretty accurate indicator of what lies ahead, this is one of the only RPGs where you can be killed at the character creation screen. After that, it's time to arm the characters with various weapons and tools. This being an extraordinarily difficult game, the weapons have degradation and limited ammunition, and the tools are consumable and scarce. You also have limited inventory space. This game predates Sweet Home, but you can see where this is going in terms of doling out resources. The main goal of the game, at least at the start, is the exploration of Weathertop Mansion. The manual provides the backstory. It's 1920. Children going up to play in a dilapidated estate in Massachusetts have been found brutally murdered, and there also have been sightings of a strange Japanese man that went into the castle to find the reasons for this and never returned. The protagonists are drawn to investigate the mansion, the reclusive family who reside in it, and if possible, understand and eliminate the evil inside. And it's when we get into the mansion that the sheer sadistic brutality of the difficulty comes into sharp focus. Once you get in, the door locks behind you with only the sound of a distant bell coming from an upper floor, and a hint from a closed door elsewhere in the mansion telling you of the next move the characters have to make. But while you're getting accustomed to the environment and combat, you quickly find that even the simplest of enemies can kill you outright very easily. The miss rate for your weapons is astronomical. There is no save function within the mansion, and with resting after combat only giving you marginal recovery while risking a surprise ambush, you have nothing else to do but push forward. What you're actually supposed to do is ascend 3 floors to the bell you just heard, ring it, and beeline for the exit. but the path up to it, despite being generally a spiral shape, is a disorienting gauntlet, as the small light of the rooms don't really indicate a good level of environmental difference, and running away from battles will sometimes manually drop you elsewhere randomly on the mansion floor. Mapping is manual as expected, but items and rooms aren't usually visible and require an examination command upon bumping into them. When you die, and you will find the next example of the game's difficulty. When your party dies, your save is wiped. All of your characters are dead, and there's a non-zero chance in future games of them coming back as powerful zombified enemies to fight future parties, according to COMPTIQ. And that isn't counting the total party kill traps lying about the mansion, which are numerous. So it's not so much a difficulty curve as a series of continual punches to the stomach. But it certainly does wonders for the tension level of the game, which is astronomical. Despite full access, it took several months for the author of the strategy guide to successfully get to the third floor, ring the bell, and quickly get back to the entrance in order to get out. Escaping the mansion also allows access to one of the game's money-making mechanisms, selling photographs, which, again, can only be taken by the journalist, of the insane things that you can encounter in the manor. Unfortunately, there is yet another attack at the player here, as the first initial sales of the ghosts are likely to be blurry and awful pictures for very little money due to the starting camera and film being incredibly poor. The frustration of running this survival gauntlet and finding this is the result caused many players to quit right then and there, and even caused the writer of the walkthrough to step away from the game for a month. This is also where the game's survival horror roots become especially relevant, as the player begins to make planned runs to get items, explore and solve puzzles, and conserve resources. There are some other systems as well. Gambling at a local tavern by playing blackjack can net a lot of money to upgrade skills with a local fortune teller, and also allow you to purchase better weapons and items with the local shops, but you never really have a sense of anything beyond being on the back foot due to the high miss rate and powerful enemies. Persevering forward and grinding, returning to sell photos, and very gradually solving puzzles, the player is able to piece together that the master of the mansion had been trying to resurrect his dead mother by communicating with supernatural forces. And eventually gaining access by completing the first floor basement and finding a secret passage on one of the upper floors, a portal is found, which transports the player to a giant castle, as they realize the 4-floor mansion was simply the first third of the game, and this gigantic castle, full of more powerful monsters and traps, is the vast majority of the rest of it. In a way, this is somewhat disappointing. The redirection to a medieval castle, complete with more fantasy-influenced monsters and traps, takes the game from being an original for the time foray into a different genre into a simple wizardry clone, and a lot of the atmosphere is lost. It isn't all bad, however. The team can now recruit powerful allies, one of which will be critical to the plot moving forward. Kenichiro Kusakabe is the actual series protagonist, an eventual mascot of the franchise overall. And in this game, he starts out as by far the most powerful party member to recruit. A spirit hunter and demonologist, Kenichiro's design would change greatly over the series, but initially, he seems quite a bit inspired by the title character in the Hammer horror film Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, an extremely fun and campy action horror film that feels like the template for Vampire Hunter D. From this point forward, the difficulty skyrockets, with instant death traps, rotating walls, teleporting mazes, and other various impediments to navigating the castle. And this is where most people would give up on the game due to the sheer wall of difficulty. Getting to the end of the game reveals that Weathertop, the Mansion Lord, in his attempts to resurrect his mother, tied himself into a dream world of mathematician and astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace, where he made a deal with an otherworldly creature in order to rule the world as a monarch in Napoleonic France. So, while Weathertop tied himself into Laplace's fantasy world, Laplace made a different deal with an eldritch creature, turning Laplace's demon from a theoretical concept into an actual physical elder god. That god was Hastur, a former deity of shepherds that desires to spread madness in the universe and is most famous for being the title character of the Robert Chambers horror classic, The King in Yellow. Hastur is the final boss of this game, and defeating it will destroy the castle and Weathertop Mansion. So as you can see, this game was fairly threadbare about the plot. But this would begin to be addressed as the lore about the world and characters would be expanded in ports, and these ports would be modified to change up gameplay and address user complaint. First off, a novelization of the game would be penned by future Lodos book author Hiroshi Yamamoto, and these expansions would prove critical to the Ghost Hunter series in the future, moving away from Wizardry's created parties and more towards something like Ultima's dedicated NPCs representing each class. Kusakabe is still just Kusakabe, as even the original game implied he might not be human because he does not age, and honestly, despite playing through the series, I have no idea what he is. But our class types have now become defined characters. The detective became Alex Quinn, a former policeman. The psyker, the wonderfully named Dick August, a psychic man on the run and desperate for cash, after being exposed as an elaborate fraud by Harry Houdini. The journalist, the practical, clever, and brave Morgan Dillon, the love interest for Alex. The scientist, the young and eager Vincent Hoffman, and the dilettante, the experienced and knowledgeable Lamont Blackwood. These characters would actually start showing up in console ports of Laplace No Ma, along with some other additional plot elements and other changes. Before that, though, X68000 and MSX ports were released the following year, and were mostly the same, except for some redrawn art and a little bit of adjustment to the difficulty, a concept that we'll see applied again and again to future entries of the Ghost Hunter series. The Super Famicom version is well documented, but it is actually the second of 2 attempts to make the game. Yanneman had developed a version of the game in 1993, and by all accounts it was a fairly close port, being a first-person dungeon crawler that looked to have been a very straightforward adaptation of the novel's version of events, featuring only that interpretation's characters, no user creation here. For reasons unknown, though, this version was never completed, and was instead retooled by other companies into the version that did make it to shelves 2 years later. This iteration was most likely a Falcon-developed game, and the only version of the story that has a fan translation currently, which, despite some early hiccups with battle menus, is quite stable now and faithfully adapts the new novelization-influenced script. Departing from Yanneman's incomplete attempt, it changes the dungeon from a 3D map to an overhead perspective as well, and puts a greater focus on Weathertop and interaction between the user-created protagonist and the characters from the novel. But the real crown jewel here is the PC Engine CD remake by Human Entertainment, which adds cutscenes and voice acting but keeps the dungeon crawler structure. You can even choose to create your own characters or recruit characters from the novel. There is also another graphical overhaul, additional sections to the mansion, and a massive adjustment to both difficulty and the money you start out with, making the game still hard, but not impossible. Both the Super Famicom and PC Engine games expand the story elements that were hinted at in the first game, clarifying the Lovecraftian elements and more concisely explaining story beats like Weathertop and the death of his mother, the ties between Weathertop and Laplace, the nature of Hastur's dream world, and the world-ending consequences should our protagonists fail. These are the strongest story-wise of the ports, and turn the game from a horror title that makes a hard left turn into a wizardry clone a third of the way through, complete with more traditional fantasy monsters and subquests, into something much more unique and compelling, keeping the wonderful atmosphere that Weathertop Mansion has throughout the entire game, especially in the PC Engine CD version. It's also darker. Not all the characters make it out alive, and the tone is much more somber, as our characters wonder if their efforts will even be successful, going against things as powerful and unknowable as eldritch monsters and alternate dimensions. However, the story of the development of the ports and sequels to the original had become quite chaotic by this point. In 1992, head of the company Mamoru Imanishi left to head a venture that combined several companies into a kind of supergroup. And viewers of this channel are well aware how those usually turn out. Made up of members of BPS, Hummingbird, and its parent company MAC, now reeling from the real estate crash that destroyed the economic bubble era in Japan, T&E Soft, Microcaben, the omnipresent Hiroyuki Imabayashi, and new to this sort of thing, Riverhill Soft, Japan Data Works was an attempt to bring the research of another company, Japan Database Network Laboratory Company, to finished products. But it hit stormy waters, only releasing 2 pinball titles and going out of business shortly afterwards. The other complication, beyond the creation's brainchild being busy with other failing projects, was the execution of how the sequels were handled. Betting on the notoriety of Laplace No Ma, as well as the success of Ghost Hunter, a tabletop RPG set in the same universe that had been released after the PC-88 game and had since become a group SNE staple, as well as the cult popularity of the novel. It was decided that a multimedia push would be the best thing to renew interest in Hummingbird's games. And while some of these would do better than others, the circumstances of the times around their releases, a competing import title with the same idea as their horror series and a much more official license, and the changes that were made in order to bring the games to a wider audience would bring about a temporary end to the series, burying an extremely underrated RPG, screwing up the release cycle, and dooming a title we'll get to a little later on. In the end, the series ended up with a very strange release order. First, the PC Engine port of the first game in the series. Second, Kurokishi no Kamen, the third game in the series. Third, a direct sequel to the first game that suffered a lot of delays, having multiple release dates listed in login, but finally making it to shelves in December of 1994 under the title Paracelsus No Maken. And finally, another port of the first game for the Super Famicom that finally came to shelves after that version developed by a different studio failed to materialize. Needless to say, this created some confusion. But first, the RPG and the direct sequel to Laplace No Ma. Paracelsus No Maken, the Sword of Paracelsus, is a much more focused and balanced RPG that takes heavy inspiration from the original novel, as well as a pair of sequel books from the same author that were being released concurrently. Instead of creating a whole party, you have only to create one character, and the rest of your group is made up of the characters from the novel. Now, instead of one gigantic and difficult dungeon, there are many, with a group of characters traveling all throughout Europe in the shadow of World War II. After reuniting for a post-wedding party for Alex and Morgan, our heroes are recruited by a mysterious billionaire to rescue a writer from a cult. Upon doing so, they are given an artifact by this aristocrat, the Dagger of Paracelsus, and are tasked to use it to find multiple secret societies. The party goes along with this somewhat reluctantly, as they are also trying to understand the source of a new party member's psychic visions of danger. And this quest will take them from Paris to Munich to Stuttgart, and to other more exotic locations such as the Orient Express and Iceland. This leads to a surprisingly modern-feeling RPG, as you go from multiple choices of location to smaller subplots in each chapter of the game, complete with subquests that allow for smaller rewards. It's strongly reminiscent of the system laid down in games like Knights of the Old Republic, and is immediately very accessible and understandable. Each story talks about a local secret society attempting some type of resurrection in order to bring back some kind of balance to the world. However, in a very well executed and recurrent theme, over-reliance on mythologizing the past results in all these planned resurrections, resulting in monstrous mockeries destroying almost everyone involved, with our heroes sometimes barely escaping with their skins. Unfortunately, the game's longest and strongest subplot is also its most problematically written. A rather compelling story about a secret society of werewolves and other creatures fighting rising fascist powers in Europe. Although the writers are clearly trying to draw real-world parallels, and NPC conversations in nearby towns show that they did their research, one of the dungeons in this section is the main concentration camp of Dachau, the longest-running camp, and the use of this in the story is handled extremely awkwardly, although it does go the super science route, and does climax with unleashing a werewolf attack on Nazi scientists, so it's not all bad. The game is actually fairly non-linear, and once again experience points are doled out non-traditionally, more for hitting story beats and progressing through levels than for fighting monsters. That, combined with a slower encounter rate, can make the boss fights tricky, but all in all, this is a much easier game, with tons of quality of life improvements including auto-mapping, and is probably the best in the series overall, and honestly, one of the most approachable for beginners Japanese RPGs I've ever played, if you're prepared to cringe at some of the more badly handled story elements in that one Munich section. On a more positive note, the writing is quite strong for the most part, excepting that one chapter, giving the characters distinctive and strong personalities, and the story of our protagonists fighting these groups among the rise of fascism across the world has them questioning their involvement and complicity. While all the institutions they encounter end up corrupt, they run into situations time and time again of groups trying to resurrect past glories and past histories, as the story continually reminds us of the failures of mythologizing a past that never really happened. As the game closes out with a letter describing their relief at stopping Europe from destruction, dated a short time before World War II begins, in a rather cruel stinger, the message is always delivered pretty clearly, even if the process to get there and stories used can sometimes get a little clunky. So other than the release date confusion, why is this game so buried, despite the obvious influence on later titles, like the Shadow Heart series, of which the first and second games lift plot elements from it wholeheartedly? Well, a lot of the failure of the multimedia release had to do with the platforms that were picked for the titles. For Paracelsus No Maken, it was decided that this would be an MS-DOS RPG title for PC 98, and have no other port, with an FM Towns port being quickly cancelled. Sadly, this wasn't a good idea at the time, as there was much more of an emphasis on consoles in Japan of that year, with even a January 1994 issue of COMPTIQ holding a large developer roundtable asking the perennial gaming magazine question, "Is PC gaming dead?" In the roundtable, it was made note that RPGs were beginning to fall off from the PC 98 specifically, and there was worry that only console versions would sell, with multiple game creators being concerned that the idea of a PC as a gaming hardware would be eliminated in the coming years. So, releasing this in December of 1994 after multiple delays, including a series of delays in login that continually drift further and further to the end of the year, making exactly dating the game a long project that it took quite a while to accomplish, may have contributed. This was also compounded by the fact that after the December 1994 release, the advertisements weren't corrected, and on sale now advertisements didn't even start to appear until 6 months into the following year. However, there was a third game in development that got done quite a bit faster, releasing in the summer of 1994, and that was a console exclusive. And with an even easier system, full motion video, a story directly adapting a popular magazine article chronicling a playthrough for ASCII-published tabletop magazine Logout in a bit of cosmic irony, and generally clever advertisements and art, it was thought that perhaps this title would be the one to keep the franchise going. Unfortunately, it was for the 3DO. Released in the summer of 1994, Kurokishi no Kamen continues the story of our novel protagonists, this time without a character creator, in a full-motion dungeon crawler RPG set in a British mansion that feels like a cross between Laplace No Ma and games like The Mansion of Hidden Souls. This time around, a much more depowered Kusakabe joins Alex, Vincent, and Morgan in investigating a haunted home which was the site of a ritualistic murder. There's not really detailed leveling up here, with just combat and healing item use defining the gameplay. This title is about par for the course for an FMV adventure game, but is still fun, if highly simplistic. If you've played The Seventh Guest, you've basically played this, although it retains a basic form of RPG combat that is unfortunately implemented terribly by using one of the worst control systems I've seen in a while, trying to utilize adventure game icons to do an RPG combat system. And while the addition of voice acting and developers and actors playing the ghosts is fun, everything's a bit overplayed and goes much more into the cheese factor. Still, it's worth playing if you like this sort of game, especially for the amusing bump noises the actors make if you hit a wall or table. Unfortunately, due to being on such a low audience adoption system, the 3DO game didn't meet expectations. And generally, the massive multimedia push to make Ghost Hunter a thing would backfire. The game simply did not sell enough to justify their cost, with coverage and consumer money going instead to games like Alone in the Dark. And audiences had also turned away from the tabletop game, with it shuttering down at the end of 1994. This would cause even more financial complications, as players who became interested in the scenario would not even get to play the tabletop games that these sequels and ports were ostensibly advertising, particularly the Super Famicom one, because with it being released in 1995, people were unable to buy the tabletop RPG by the time of its final release, due to it already having been taken off the market. Hummingbird Soft would continue to develop and release PC ports for a couple more years, with their last title being a computer game adaptation of infamously terrible anime Garzy's Wing. But after 1997, it stopped putting out software, and the Imanishis vanished from the industry, with the Ghost Hunter series, at least for computer, seemingly put to rest. Thankfully, though, there was one aspect of the series that still had some health left in it: the tabletop RPG system. Despite audiences in 1994 turning away from it, player interest in the system had grown after the port's initial releases, and growing user inquiry caused Group SNE to reverse course and resurrect Ghost Hunter in 2002, selling multiple scenarios and gamebooks and making the game much more of a staple of their library. This would continue with another revision in 2012, and a final spin-off game in 2017 that combined board game-like tile play with a more traditional RuneQuest-based system of previous tabletop editions, and a scenario that somewhat reworks Kurokishi no Kamen. The novels would relaunch as well, and there would even be an attempt at one last game. Launched for mobile phones in 2020, Ghost Hunter: The Demon Sea of Alcaringa continues the adventures of its protagonists, this time investigating Aboriginal magic in Australia. This is a simple puzzle game with visual novel elements, almost a hidden object game, really. And unfortunately, it did not sell well at all, selling at barely a fraction of even the 3DO and PC-98 games. And while the novels would continue for a long time, with Hiroshi Yamamoto becoming an acclaimed science fiction writer across many decades, unfortunately the author passed away in 2024 due to a combination of aspiration pneumonia and long COVID-related symptoms. And while this seems like the end of the series, hopefully the console release of Laplace No Ma on Project Egg, the current license holder of earlier entries in the series after D4 Enterprise picked it up in 2014, will put more eyes on it. While this series has always remained obscure and on the periphery, it still remains an influential step in the formation of survival horror. The difficulty missteps of the original, and the memorable nature of the opening hours of the game, influenced other designers to tweak the difficulty and limitations slightly, contributing to the tough but mostly fair atmosphere that continued with Sweet Home and drew a direct line to modern survival horror. The second game's shift to globetrotting adventure, with a focus on mixing 20th century lore and history with more fantastical elements, brings to mind Kudelka and its sequels, the Shadow Heart series. And the 3DO games show the frustrations of trying to join a genre that you helped invent, only for other games to have surpassed you. But through all of this, the talent and experimentation of Hummingbird Soft, the imagination of Group SNE and Hiroshi Yamamoto, and the ingenuity of the many companies that worked on rebalancing and reinterpreting the first game especially, still show us that even in the most obscure of places, systems can be found that end up in the games we still play close to 40 years later. See you next time. So this video took a long time to come out, and because of that, a lot of research and a lot of help was needed to get it over the finish line. So, a lot of people with a lot of cool projects provided some information to get this through, and I'd like to talk about them for a second before going to the Patreon. First off, we have Jason Dyer. Jason Dyer has a project called All of the Adventures, where he goes through every single adventure game ever made, starting from mainframe and going up to the early 80s. His blog has been running for a number of years, and it is exceptional, as well as his research, which was a tremendous help in figuring out some of the early parts of Hummingbird Soft. Next, we have Borp, Auquid, and the many other members of the Group SNE translation projects. While there are more official translations of Lodos material coming out nowadays, the many other members of the Group SNE project have been doing it for years, releasing lots and lots of documentation and systems, and providing a great service in getting us to understand exactly what was going on with things like the Record of Lodos War replays. Please check them out if you can. Special thanks to Ethan Johnson, Ragebeat, and the other members of the Gaming Alexandria Discord for some providing of photos and other historical documentation. And with that, that's pretty much it for this time. Special thanks to the users on the Patreon, including James B., Matt Leffler, Peter Tushar, Randall Egerbauer, Andro, Yorsk, Mooware, The King of Homestyle, King Gidra, Joseph Holly, and Patrick B. As always, subscribing to the Patreon will allow you access to certain bonuses, and this time around, it'll be a deeper look at the story of Paracelsus No Maken, as Vimeo's somewhat more lax censorship will allow me to talk about the story and themes a bit more explicitly. Thank you all very much for watching and for your patience, and I'll see you next time.